All right, Antonieta, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Antonieta Contreras. Antonieta, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you.
Awesome. So Antonieta, a former banker, originally educated as a mathematician, is a trauma psychotherapist who graduated with a master's in social work from NYU. After forming her clinical skills as a gestalt therapist and training at agencies with highly traumatized people, she received a specialization in trauma studies from the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapies and in Human Sexuality from NYU School of Medicine. Antonieta maintains a private practice where she combines different trauma modalities as well as the contemplative techniques that she learned from studying within Buddhist traditions. Her book, Traumatization and Its Aftermath, a systemic approach to understanding and treating trauma disorders, received the award for the best book of 2023 in the category of Psychology, Mental Health Division by the American Book Fest. Antonieta, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I was born in Mexico City and I live in New York City now. Big
Okay.
cities.
Okay. So this book, we're going to talk about this book today. This is very comprehensive. I mean, you pack a lot in here and in a very interesting way. So let's start. What was the impetus for writing this?
Um, Two main things. One was that was teaching for several years the foundation of the trauma studies program, a postgraduate program for clinicians. And I really went into the research of what it means to be traumatized. And I discovered every year, taught for several years, that every year there were new findings and more understanding and different perspectives, different options. Like even last week, a very important finding came out about memory, how
Mhm.
memories get that actually are not memories. So kind of many of the principles that we use in some of our techniques are going to be redefined because of these findings. So that's what I noticed, that there were findings all the time that were really changing the conversation about what trauma was, and that many people had stayed in the original description of fight flight and simple things, that
Mhm.
it has become much more complex. So that was one of the reasons, to include all the new findings and bring them into updating the concepts of trauma. And the second one was that I participate a lot in platforms in social media, and there are so many questions about trauma and so many misinformation and misunderstanding of what it means. And it breaks my heart to see that people get confused, assign labels to themselves, they feel defeated, and
Mhm.
they are not going to get better. So I answer a lot of these questions, and I noticed that there was the need to solidify all those answers in a book that responds to all these questions that people have.
So give us an example of one such bit of misinformation that people might have. You mentioned a couple things, but share with us.
Well, for example, um, the New York Magazine a couple of months ago, I think, or last month, came with a cover says trauma, America's favorite diagnosis, right? So right there, trauma is not a diagnosis, for instance, right? But
Mhm.
it's our favorite one. So
Mhm.
what's going on? What is the diagnosis? What is the injury? What is the disorder? Instead of like calling trauma everything from the event, many people say, oh, the trauma that somebody gave me. Like trauma is not something that people give you, right? Like
Mhm.
it's an injury that your nervous system goes through or your whole system goes through when you confront situations that are extremely dangerous or activating, and you can't handle them.
Mm-hmm.
So trauma is not the event, trauma is not only the injury, trauma is not the diagnosis, trauma is not the reaction, trauma is not, is many things, right? So that is an example.
Okay. You also, prior to that, you mentioned something about fight and flight, and saying it's not really that simple.
Yeah.
Expound on that, please. Yeah.
Well, I really make emphasis in my book about post-traumatic and peri-traumatic mechanisms that we have, because the fight or flight normally describes stress, like we all experience fight or flight when we get angry, for example, but that doesn't mean that the survival circuits are activated or that we are fearing for our lives, right? And even so, when we get really scared, some mechanisms start getting activated, but then once the danger goes away, there are other things that happen to the system, the post-traumatic, let's say, that we adopt as strategies. I also make the differentiation into preventive and protective mechanisms at the peri-traumatic ones, because, for instance, freeze is a mechanism that people confuse whether comes after fight, flight, freeze, that
Mm-hmm.
comes after the fight, right? And that is not really freeze. Well, people call it that, but there is a preventive mechanism that actually paralyzes us in a rigid way before the fight and flight mechanism gets activated, because we need that time to really understand the level of danger before we act. And then after the fight or flight, the immobilization comes that are very different in terms of what happens, what is happening to us. And in freeze is rigidity, in immobilization is loss of tone or muscle tone, and etc. And they need different interventions. We need to understand the differences between them in order for us to help the clients that take that strategy as a survival way to cope with their lives, right? So a rigid person is very different, needs very different interventions than a dissociated person that comes with
Mm-hmm.
mobilization, right? So those little differences are very important in terms of how we treat our clients.
So, in terms of the book, how did you organize the book?
Haha. Oh my God, it took me like a lot of work to organize it, because there is so much information that I needed to share. So first, the part one, I wanted to talk about the whole neurobiology and all the consequences and all the elements that take have a role into this, like emotions and memory and all these that I call them trauma domains that get affected, right? So I explain the process, I explain the neurobiology, I explain all the mechanisms. And then in part two, I separated the different types of traumatization. Traumatization is the process that starts when we get really afraid, scared, shocked, surprised, like really is afraid of our lives, right? To the moment that we resolve the fear of or the belief that we can lose our integrity or our lives. That process can be short or can be prolonged for a very, very long time if we keep thinking or feeling that we are in danger, because the brain recognizes those signals as the cue to stay in survival mode, right? So the second part, I wanted to be very specific on the types of alterations that our system goes through with each one of the different ways to get traumatized, from day one to, for instance, complex trauma. Like people talk about PTSD and CPTSD, complex PTSD, right? complex PTSD includes everything that means prolonged or repeated sense of threat or danger, right? But it's very different if you get it young, at 1 or a 3 or a 7 or a 20 or a 60, right? There are differences in when do you get that type of prolonged, because it doesn't mean, like, there are people that have good childhood, but then they have a bad relationship, and then they endure years of abuse. They were healthy, but that endurance starts affecting their nervous system little by little. And of course, the consequences are different than if you have to endure it when you are 2 years old, right?
Right.
So I wanted to separate all the different types of ways we can get traumatized and their effects. So if it's attachment thing before we are born or at birth, or if it's a social and institutionalized oppression, or if it's, I separated, for instance, abuse from neglect. Normally they put it together. So I have separated them because abuse has different consequences in the system than neglect, for instance. Right? So I try to dissect as much as possible the different reasons we can get traumatized, and I separated them in the reasons and the consequences.
Wow. Let's highlight that for a little bit. Abuse and neglect. Talk a little bit about how they're different and how they, with the understanding that it impacts people differently, of course.
Right. Well, abuse is a frontal, how we call it. It asks for a reaction right away, right? Right away. If I scream at you, you have to react there with aggression or with avoidance, right? And
Hmm.
it's easier to identify the wound if it's abuse than if it's neglect, because neglect, there are many other elements that can play a part on the traumatization or not. Some people are neglected and are actually not traumatized. They learn to cope, they may internalize certain ideas about themselves, but they don't fear for their survival. So the survival mechanisms don't get activated the same way as if somebody is hitting you,
Right.
right? Or punishing you or insulting you. So I I want to normalize, but also to depathologize trauma, that not everybody that was even abused or neglect developed trauma. And why we could develop a trauma disorder from the circumstances. So for instance, if you get neglected and then you develop a huge sense of shame for the neglect, that you internalize it in that way, that could be the trigger for you to activate those circuits. But then the intervention again is very different than somebody that gets angry and immediately fight back. The neglected person with shame is not going to fight back, is going to probably dissociate, and the intervention needs to go into the shame, not into the fear first, right? So things like that.
So when I speak with you, Antonietta, I realize how much there is to know and understand about. I mean, when you started researching for this book, it seems like there's a wealth of information. Is there a lot of information that a lot of people just don't know about?
Mhm. Yes, there is a lot, because um, there are articles in journals more than books, right? I think we rely a lot on books, and we
Right.
rely a lot on the dozen of people that talk about one topic, and then we hear the same idea over and over and over again, and it programs the
Mm.
the way of thinking about certain things, but we need to be actualized and put together things. Like we in psychology, we still use a very medical model. And if you think about medicine, well, the cardiologist has nothing to do with your stomach, right? For
Mm-hmm.
example. So a little bit like that. Sometimes in psychology, you either take care of the memories or you take care of the thoughts, for
Mm-hmm.
right. And now you take care of the body, and we don't put them together. I missed to mention that the third part of the book is about a model to apply all these modalities that is integrative, because the integration of all our parts is essential for us to heal, right? Sometimes, for instance, let's say we are processing memories, or we are talking or using cognition with a person that doesn't have a sense of self developed or is very weak. The work is kind of going into the ether, because there is no self that can take in the ideas or the progress of the interventions or the treatment. So we need to develop a sense of self first, for having someone to observe themselves and to have reflective capacities on what is going on internally, right? So that integration, so that I think that way of seeing things is not very popular. We are not used to put together things, and that's what I was trying to do in the book, to put together. Rejection is a very interesting thing. For instance, is there kind of very separated from the trauma world, and is essential to understand attachment injuries, right? Because the main injury is this rejection sensitivity that people develop, that is what becomes the fear, right? The danger is to be rejected, the threat. So I brought that theory, the rejection sensitivity theory, into the book to put it together with the other parts that we have, as a way to understand the big picture.
I mean, you obviously and clearly have such a passion for this. How did this develop?
The passion?
Yeah.
Well, I have been always very passionate in general, like it's part of my traits, right? And I also include all the the chemicals and the neurobiology of temperament, for example, right? If you produce more serotonin than dopamine, is you have different traits or whatever. But yeah, I have always been very, very energetic and very passionate. And I saw suffering. As a Buddhist, I understood that it's not the discipline only, it's not the hope only, it's not the faith only, it needs many more things. And the support of a community, for instance, in Buddhism, emotions, and in other religions, I'm also Catholic, and in Catholicism, being angry or experiencing envy is a sin, for
Mm-hmm.
example, right? Or in Buddhism, is a delusion. And at some point, I realized that we as humans need to embrace those emotions in order for us to be healthier emotionally. And if we didn't, we were just going to continue suffering them and being ashamed of even having emotions, because we are humans. So and then the suffering in all sorts of environments, right? Like people suffer in different ways, and it all get affected. So yeah, I want to continue helping and having the hope that I can continue helping people, and that more people need help. One of the reasons I became a teacher was to train trauma therapists, for them to be more of us, uh,
Mm-hmm.
helping people overcome this ugly place we live in when we don't get out of the trauma, right? Of the traumatization, this darkness, this loss of hope, this sense of defeat that is characteristic of a person that keeps in survival mode. So we need to be more of us. We need to have more awareness. We need to really battle that and make people more functional and more like capable of being happy.
So who is the book for? Is it for just basically anyone who wants to learn about trauma? Is it specifically for mental health clinicians who want to learn about trauma?
I debated in which direction to go. And then I sold the book to a publisher that publishes textbooks, right? So it's both. I like the idea that the therapist reads it and then share it with the client, maybe a chapter, maybe two, for them to understand certain things. I believe in psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is essential to heal. If we don't know what is going on with us, we judge ourselves and we don't get over it. So I think it's a very nice psychoeducation tool. But I already have couple of new clients and several calls, consultations from people, lay people that have read the book and that are finding a lot of help in reading it. So it's for both people, for both sectors.
In terms of um, uh, trauma treatment, what are your thoughts on how, excuse me, on the current state of trauma treatment modalities? You were saying, many therapists now are learning from the books that are coming out, the popular books that are coming out from the 12 popular people. And that
Mm-hmm.
makes a lot of sense to me. So, in response to that, how do you feel in terms of the trauma treatment modalities out there? Are they adequate? Are people learning enough, or what?
All of them are useful. People need to also know why they are useful and when they are useful, right? If they don't understand the the difficulties that the person has and the parts that need to be treated, they can jump into one modality, skipping many steps that if they are not treated, they are not going to have successful
Mhm.
treatments, right? So, for instance, neurofeedback is an amazing tool for regulation, but it doesn't help with processing. EMDR is a great tool for processing or somatic experiencing for processing, but they don't are not focusing in regulation. And
Mhm.
you need both elements. But on top of that, what I think is that the treatment needs to be understood as dynamic. So today we have a model that was first proposed by escaping right now his name, but 100 years ago, Janet. Janet proposed a model for trauma that then Judith Herman adopted, and then Ford and several others. But it's a linear model, right? It's stabilization, processing and reprogramming. And it never happens that way. We
Mm.
need to use a dynamic model that sees what is required and starts, I said, building blocks, start using building blocks for the alterations and the domains we need to work on in order to build the foundation for a successful treatment. So that is also an important thing. People need to understand what they are doing before applying a modality, because a modality alone is not going to make the trick.
And I think that's a good example. That trauma treatment modality is that was put forth by Judith Herman. It's still used today very commonly, as you're saying, and people need to understand that it's not going to go linearly like that. It's much more dynamic. So as a result, uh, are you saying that clinicians need to, or therapists need to just study more modalities?
Well, first my book, because the book is going to tell them what trauma treatment should move like, right?
Right.
And then choose the modalities that resonate more with them and know how they should be applied for certain things. For instance, I do adjunct work sometimes for EMDR. If somebody has their therapist and they have been developing a relationship, and that's wonderful. But at the moment that they are stable and need to process, they could be sent to a different therapist to work on those pieces or that part of the treatment. For instance, if somebody is not good at developing self and doesn't understand that, well, maybe you find a colleague that is specialized in that type of modality, or you learn it, right? But you need to have a broader understanding of what it needs to be done for the person to recover. Personality disorders, for instance, right? You cannot go and process memories when they don't even know where they are, you know?
Mhm.
It's a different level of understanding of what happened to them that made them adapt into that type of behavior and regulation that needs to be addressed as such.
Awesome. The book is called Traumatization and Its Aftermath, a systemic approach to understanding and treating trauma disorders. If you're a mental health clinician and interested in trauma or working with trauma, you need to get this book. We'll have the links up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. And on Antonieta, they can get it on your website, obviously, which is what?
AntonietaContreras.com.
Okay, and we'll have that linked up as well. Antonieta, so inspiring. This book is a game changer. And I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your inspiration with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care.
Ciao.